welcome everyone. How's it going? How's it going? This is the Conscious Chicano. Today it's Conscious Chat number 35. The topic is Reies, Lopez, Tijerina, the land back movement, and Pentecostalism. So, welcome if you join me on Instagram or on YouTube. If you want to join my video discussion after I give my view on Tijerina, come to my YouTube chat, and I left my link there if you want to join uh, and contribute to the discussion. And if you come into my YouTube, definitely check out the details. I have links there, links to my Rumble account. I post a lot of deep, interesting stuff on Rumble because Rumble doesn't censor like these major platforms. And also, if you want to send me a message on this topic, you want some links and resources, books, um, send me a message on one of my links on Instagram. Or if you want to connect and have me on your podcast or your YouTube channel, or if you want to come on mine, send me a message. And also click on my Twitter, and we're just my Twitter account, the Conscious Chicano. I have a link there, and add me. I'm just and retweeting a lot of information. We actually have a terrain community that's there that exposing a lot of stuff, and I participate a lot of times in that terrain discussion. But anyways, so um, definitely, that's that's it on the details there. And so let's get to the topic. Reyes, Lopez, Tijerina, the land back movement, and Pentecostalism. So many in the Chicano, many people coming out of Chicano studies um, they just hear a little bit about Reyes, Lopez, Tijerina, or if you see like a PBS documentary, you kind of, that whole Chicano PBS documentary, they briefly go into Reyes, Lopez, Tijerina. He's known to be one of, like, the major Chicano activists in the whole Chicano movement. If you guys don't know what the Chicano movement was, it was a movement of Chicanos out here in the Southwest during the 60s and 70s. They rose up in political activism and were basically fighting against the injustices, done to, Mexicans in the United States. And they called themselves Chicanos because it was kind of like a political statement, and they created their own identity. And usually when you called yourself a Chicano or Chicana back then, it meant more than just a cultural identity. It was a political activism. It was basically an identity that involved fighting for your people and their rights, against systemic oppression, against discrimination, racism, inequalities, and everything. Because it was rampant back then. I mean, it still is to this very day, but it was back then. It was really explicit and blatant, right in your face. Although it still exists, it's still kind of blatant too at times. Um, but yeah, the Chicano movement, you guys should definitely look into that. Take some Chicano studies. You'll learn about that. There's some actually good books on the whole subject. But Reyes Lopez Tijerina was he was a major player in the Chicano movement, and and a lot of times the Chicano studies, they're very secular at times, atheists or they embrace atheistic communism. And what happens is that and I used to be a Marxist as well, but and there's some good um, ideas within Marxism, but I don't see it as a solution, you know. But there's some good critiques of capitalism from Marxism. Definitely, the way I see it is statism is a problem, even with the capitalist statism or Marxist statism, or different types of governments out here. I'm more of a Chicano anarchist, but a lot of times the Chicano studies, they just focus on his secular activism, and they don't get into Tijerina's religious background, his Pentecostal background, and this is why I'm getting into it, because I'm also a Chicano and a Pentecostal as well, and an activist. I've been an activist for a long time, and I see the same things that Tijerina. A lot of his qualities there is like he's a Chicano, he's into Pentecostalism, and an activist too, major player in the Chicano movement. And he kind of gives me inspiration, like in some sense, like, and I think a lot of Chicanos should actually get some inspiration as well from Reyes Lopez Tijerina. And interesting is that sometimes you have these white scholars out here talking about the history of Tijerina, and they'll come out with some half truths and facts, but then they'll try to paint him as a psychotic person, as a cultish figure, and a religious nut. And so they'll try to like make you think that he was all about that, and that's the way he was, and that explains his actions, when his actions were legitimate and historically legitimate. And so Reyes Tijerina was a complex person, complex figure, just like everybody else. But he was involved. He was a minister. A lot of people don't even know that he was involved in the Assemblies of God, which was an old school Pentecostal denomination, and he attended Bible school and became a preacher. And he was known for his fire and brimstone type preaching. And if you guys don't know what fire and brimstone preaching is, it's kind of like prophetic preaching. It's like exposing a lot of corruption out here, promoting social justice. And Tijerina, he saw lots of social justice in the Bible, and that actually influenced him in his activism and his fiery rhetoric. So as a preacher, a lot of times, when you become a fire and brimstone type preacher, your rhetoric is very, it's not quiet, and you're bold, So he actually learned his rhetorical skills from preaching, and this leaked over to his Chicano activism. Definitely. How's it going? Casual conversation. So, yeah, Tijerino was a Pentecostal preacher, and I was actually looking into the whole Pentecostalism. A lot of a lot of that denomination has been influenced. I mean, they've gotten into civil rights, and social justice issues. They have a whole history of that. So they're saying that one of the influences on Tijerina is the social justice and the civil rights activism of Pentecostalism that influenced Tijerina. So, and Tijerina definitely contextualized that and made it a Chicano type Pentecostal activism, and he influenced a lot of people in the Chicano movement. And he's kind of known as the Malcolm X of Chicanos. I think even more hardcore because he actually was very radical in terms of the whole land back movement. So these days we hear a lot of these mexicas talking about land back, right? Land back. Well, Tijerina was ahead of his time at that time, and he was all about land back, and so he was advocating for the land grants. The land grants were definitely, if you guys don't know about the land grant history, um, it was given by colonial Spain, and then later on the Mexican government. So when Spain had control, there was times where they gave land to they allowed the natives to have land, right, and as well as people in Mexico as well to have their ownership over their land. And um, and so what happened is when there's independence occurred, and Mexico broke from Spain, Mexico did adopt the land grants, and still maintained them, so allowed natives to have their land as well as Mexicans. And um, and sometimes I hear people from the Anglo perspective, the U.S. perspective, saying that the Spaniards were worse than the Anglos, and I debate that actually. And if you see the actions of what Spain did, and yeah, they have a bad colonial history with the natives, but they did give land grants to native people as well. So that's an interesting fact about history. And Mexico actually inherited that whole concept and policy, and gave natives and Mexicans their ownership over their land, right? And this included the whole Southwest of the United States as well. And so what happened in history is that when the U.S. Anglos came and invaded Mexico, which was part of the Southwest, they came and basically went at war with Mexicans, and basically brought their colonialism, their brutality, discrimination, and all that, their racism. And what they were doing is, they were taking land away from Mexicans and Native Americans, and that were already there, settled with their land. And um, and what they did is they basically imposed and forced the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. um, as they created that, and forced the Mexican government to go along with that treaty. And so Tijerina saw that treaty. He didn't like that treaty, and he says that was just a tactic for the U.S. Anglos to actually, little by little, start taking the land. And what was going on is that the treaty was supposedly supposed to recognize uh, natives and Mexicans who still wanted to reside in the Southwest. It was supposed to recognize their ownership over the land, but the United States actually was even breaking those treaties, I mean that treaty, and using courts to actually rob Mexicans and natives of their land, and basically kicking out Mexicans from their land as well, and so they used their legal system to do that, and their legal system was corrupt. If you don't know the history of the courts and the legal system in the United States, they always favored Anglos and white people. And for example, even when sometimes natives or African Americans or Mexicans would be unjustly criminalized by their courts by an all white jury, so they would use their courts to basically justify certain legalities, and so the U.S. used their corrupt courts to take the lands from the natives and the Mexicans of the Southwest, and don't ever let anybody make you believe that the U.S. Won this land fair and square. They use different deceptive tactics and savage tactics as well. They invaded the lands, and they were oppressing the Mexican and Native people of the Southwest, murdering them, lynching them. They had lynch mobs. Some of the most people think African Americans were the only ones being lynched, but Mexicans throughout the Southwest were being lynched. And you had like the Texas Rangers, the KKK, and all of them were doing that kind of stuff and taking people's land. They were basically pushing people off, Mexicans and natives off their land and robbing them of their land and resources. And so they would also, not only through their court system, but even by force under the gun, take people's lands, and they would kick them out. This is where that whole anti-immigration hate started. This is where it all started, ever since the Anglos of the United States invaded the Southwest. This is where their hate originates from, and it still exists to this very day. And interesting that I found out that the United States, through their court system, would use a thing called eminent domain, and they basically they would legitimize taking native and Mexican land, um, and their reasoning was that, we can take individual owner we could take an individual's land in order to benefit the public, right? And so they would use this tactic to steal land from people and from Mexicans and natives, and claim that, we're doing this for the good of the public, right, or for the government. So it was just basically a strategy to rationalize land theft. So Tijerina saw all of this, and also, I forgot another fact is that after the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo, eventually, little by little, like native Mexicans and natives were losing their land, and landowners ownership eventually reduced to 10%. 10%, Mexican ownership of the Southwest was reduced to only 10%. And this is how much stolen land the U.S. took from Mexicans and natives out here in the Southwest. So that's very interesting to know there. And so Tijerina he knew about all this corruption, and so this is why he got stirred up, and he actually saw what the Anglos were doing in the Southwest, stealing Mexican land, discriminating against them, rationalizing it, justifying it, and oppressing Mexican people and native people. And so he got tired of this, and so he saw what was going on. And so and a lot of times the Anglos were trying to criminalize Mexicans when they didn't even commit crimes and everything, and pushing them off their land and everything. Um, and so Tijerina saw, he also he looked into the whole land grants and everything, and the whole Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and he saw that there was legal precedent of Mexicans having ownership over their land, as well as natives as well, through these land grants. And so he rejected the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and he saw that that was just a tactic to for the U.S. government to little by little take Mexican and native land. So this is why he had a big issue with that, and eventually culminated in what's it called, a citizen's arrest of certain people in the U.S. government, um, and I think it was some people involved in the judicial system. Sometimes I fumble with certain words, but yeah, he had he tried doing a citizen's arrest over certain people who were involved in the judicial system, and eventually it culminated in like a shootout, and and so what happened is, yeah, eventually you know that occurred, and so Tijerina was like known as kind of like he's kind of like the Malcolm X of the Chicanos, and his approach wasn't really passive, um, as in Cesar Chavez, um, but he's a lot of times he's at that time the courts in the U.S. were trying to make him look like he was actually the bad guy, the bandito and stuff like that, when in fact he was just defending his people against the criminality of the U.S. government at that time, that was forcefully killing Mexicans and taking their land, lynching them, doing all kinds of atrocities. And so Reyes Tijerina, said basically like, hey, we're not getting justice here, and this government and this United States court system is not, really, following, the justice in some sense. So he saw it as a way that Mexicans should basically resist this oppression and everything, and he sought out for in legal ways, you know and he always resorted back to the land grants, and the legitimacy of Mexicans having ownership of their land, especially in the Southwest, as well as Native Americans. Interesting that Reyes Tijerina at this time, a lot of Chicano studies don't mention that he was a Pentecostal. He was a Pentecostal preacher, and he was involved in the Chicano activism, and I think this needs to be highlighted because a lot of times Chicano studies is anti-religion, right? Even though a lot of Chicanos involved in activism, early on were, very religious, and Tijerina was one of them. And and he was involved in not only in Pentecostalism, but he was involved with a lot of the movements back then. He worked with the American Indian movement, obviously the Brown Berets, the Black Panthers, and he also, had talks with the Nation of Islam as well. He actually admired what the Nation of Islam was doing for Black people and empowering them, and he kind of wanted to do that as well with the Chicanos, and he was also, into the social justice of the Bible, and in a sense, and he would, kind of identify with Moses, and Moses leading, his people out of the oppression of the Egyptians and everything. And he also, was into the apocalyptic literature of the Book of Revelations and everything. And he saw Western society, the U.S. and the Western colonial system as the beast in the Book of Revelations. And interesting, interesting take on this. And so he kind of mixed his Pentecostalism with Chicanismo, and so and his fiery rhetoric was the result of, you know of that, and his pursuit for justice for the Chicano people, and he was actually a very inspiration, big time inspiration for a lot of Chicanos and Chicanas out here. And yeah, it's just interesting that he was also Pentecostal, and he actually, um, he made a mark, in history, and and you know, a lot of these Mexicas are all into this land back movement. Well, you guys, I know some of the criticisms is that, oh, it's the land back, move, like Tijerina called himself Hispano. He identified as a Spaniard. Um, what else? Yeah, the whole grants came from Spain and this and that. That's one of the criticisms of, say, from the Mexicas and everything. But let me tell you this: the Tijerina was, the whole Mexica yo and all this. It wasn't at that time. It wasn't big time throughout the whole Chicano community out here. So, um, but you could say Tijerina was, he was still down for the brown people. There's definitely, I mean, people, the Chicano mindset evolves, right? And so now we don't identify as Hispanic, right? But you still can't dismiss those who paved the way of, especially in Chicano history and Chicano activism. So we may have these old school Chicanos out here still calling themselves Hispanics or Mexican American, um, and but many a times you know they have been involved in activism and fighting for our people's rights and have paved the way. So we can't just dismiss people based on little details here and there. You got to see the overall picture, and so Tijerina, we should definitely value his contributions to the Chicano movement, and acknowledge even him as being a Pentecostal, and how Pentecostalism even influenced his social justice, his civil rights, and also his fiery rhetoric, and definitely acknowledge that as well. A lot of people in Chicano studies don't want to talk about that; they shy away from that. So, we need to acknowledge that, and the whole land back movement, it's like these Mexicas, they need to realize that, hey, it was a start, it was a start. And so, and even the Zapatistas, they were all for the land grants as well, early on. This is why the whole Mexican Revolution occurred, right? Is because, at that time, uh, because of Spain, they allowed, the indigenous people, Chiapas and all in southern Mexico, to have their land, right, as through the land grants. And what happened is, the Mexican government, ag- they acknowledged that, but then later tried taking the land away from, the people in southern Mexico, the indigenous people. And this is why there was an uprising in the, with the whole Zapatista movement, EZLN and everything. So, an interesting fact that a lot of Mayans are Pentecostal too. So many of you guys in Mexicayo, you guys are anti-Christian and all that, but we see a lot of major figures who are in, influenced by social justice and civil rights and all that, from the Bible. And there's some interesting Pentecostal history going on too. If you guys don't know, Pentecostalism is different from, it's different from what you regular think of in terms of Catholicism and other, denominations of Christianity. But yeah, a lot of Mayans are Pentecostal, and and so, but the whole land grant stuff, the EZLN were definitely, all in favor of the land grants granted by Spain as well as the Mexican government. And Reyes Lopez Tijerina was in favor of that as well. And so he was fighting for indigenous land back stolen from the U.S. Government, and he was fighting for Mexican and indigenous land back as well. So, critiques of the land back movement of Reyes Lopez Tijerina is just, is kind of trying to give a modern perspective on things, when they were, a product of their time, and to me, I don't care if Tijerina didn't have that consciousness of him being native, and at times there's Mexicans who say, oh, they're Spaniards, right? And it's because of colonialism, self hate, and everything. But Tijerina was, he was brown. He was proud of being, Mexican, of Mexican descent. And he definitely was for indigenous land back rights, Mexican land back rights as well. And when I say Mexican, Mexicans also involve natives as well. So there's many natives who identify as Mexicans. So don't think it's all about Spain and Spaniards. So this is, the land back movement. Uh, it originates back to indigenous times, where, you know, when, the resistance, right, where the indigenous resistance towards stolen land, right. But there's also a fact of history that the land grants were involved in that, resistance as well. And the indigenous people saw that as a tool to solidify their land ownership. And so this is why even Zapata, that, in the Mexican Revolution, were, fighting for the indigenous land ownership to be maintained. And later on, the EZLN and the Zapatista movement, and then later on in the modern Chicano movement. So I actually was telling somebody the other day that the Mexican Revolution influenced the Chicano movement. And so we see this right here with Tijerina, who was also, advocating for the land grants and native land rights and Mexican land rights. So some interesting history going on there. And interesting fact that the Mayans are Pentecostal, and then you have Reyes Tijerina, who was also Pentecostal as well. And Reyes Tijerina. So I read up on Reyes Tijerina, and he did face discrimination in the Pentecostal church too, because you obviously had whites in the Pentecostal churches who wanted to control things and basically dominate. And so Reyes Tijerina kind of like broke off from the white establishment, and he started setting up his own churches in some sense, his own ministry, and would preach to the Chicanos and Chicanas in the church, and he would preach social justice, civil rights. He would highlight the inequalities and all that. He had that fire and brimstone preaching, very similar to even how you hear some of the black church. A lot of times the black church, the preachers, they preach about social justice and you know um, they expose a lot of things out here, and highlight the oppression of black people. Well, Reyes Tijerina was doing it back then as well, and he was preaching to the Chicanos and Chicanas about their oppression, and he also found social justice in the Bible. For example, when the Egyptians were oppressing the Israelites, right? And Moses told the Pharaoh to let my people go, right? And so a lot of times in the liberation theologies out here, you have black and brown preachers out here identifying with that, and they see that Western oppression, the Euro oppression of people of color, is they equate that to the Pharaoh, right? and and so they identify with those passages of social justice in the Bible, or they will look into the apocalyptic literature, especially in the book of Revelations, and they'll identify the beast as being the Western civilization, and there's truth to a lot of these interpretations too, as well. So definitely, Tijerina was bringing the social justice, the Chicano social justice, into the Pentecostal, teachings and his preachings as well. And he was influencing people with the to he was influencing the brown people to become activists, to get involved in their community, to fight for the Chicano cause, and yeah, he was a major player in the Chicano movement, and he worked with MLK too, Martin Luther King, and a lot of American Indian movements. He worked with the um, was it the Black Panthers, the Brown Berets, and all that. So people, you Chicanos and Chicanas, need to really study up on this guy, and be aware though. You have these white scholars out here trying to make him look like a crazy cultist leader. They're trying to make him look like a David Koresh or was that Jim Jones and all that, and they do this because they don't like what he stands for. He stood for the land grants, the Mexicans having their land in the Southwest, and the natives as well, and he stood for social justice, and is and he was against the oppression by the Europeans, and it's in particular the Anglos and everything. Um, so you got to be careful with these so-called white scholars out here who try to make him look like he was some kind of cult, leader, and at the same time they're sneaking that in while they're giving you half truths about him. So just be aware of their deceptive tactics. And I caught on to this. I've been to some lectures with some white scholars and white professors on Tijerina, and that's how they are. They're sneaky, and so just be aware of that when you're actually reading information about Tijerina and some um, if you're listening to some of those lectures. But anyways, Tijerina went down on history as a brown Chicano Pentecostal preacher, you know, preaching the social justice, the liberation theology from a Chicano perspective, you know. So he paved the way. He paved the way out here for you Chicanos and Chicanas out here, and definitely advocating. He was an OG when it came to the land back movement, and so some of the whole land back issues is quite interesting. That um, times where they don't want Mexicans to have they don't want Mexicans for to have their land back, you know, and a lot of these Anglos will try to maneuver in their rhetoric to try to make you believe that you don't deserve your land back, right? And I got into debates with Anglos too, on social media, and how they're claiming, oh, they fairly won the war and this and that. Oh, they did. They didn't use fair tactics. They used deceptive maneuvering, violence, to take people's land. That's what they've done in history, especially in the United States. They did it to the natives. They did it to the Mexicans as well. So, um, but yeah, it's just they'll use different tactics and you know to try to justify themselves, and but there's no excuse for atrocities, for violence, colonialism from the Anglo society, and we see this, and some of these Anglos have influenced even Mexicans out here. Some of you Mexicans out here have been influenced by Eurocentrism. You'll side with the Anglo, right? And this is a problem as well. You got Mexicans or Chicanos out here who oppose the land back movement, who side with the Anglo, and this is how the European uses division to keep us divided and conquered. You know, so just don't fall into his deception and get the facts right, get the facts down. And definitely, and also this whole treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was, a lot of times the U.S. government, every time they had formed treaties, you say with Mexicans or natives, a lot of times it was through violence under the gun, right? And they were forced to sign certain treaties, right? Or get killed, right? Or they were bribed and deceived, and so um, this is their tactics, and that's why the native says, oh, the white man has a forked tongue, just be careful with him, basically, and that's how he is, very deceptive and manipulative, and presents himself as, like, as the good guy, right? We have this Clint Eastwood movies, and the Mexicans always depicted as the bandito, right? and the white guy is the good guy, right? This is how they use mass media deception, just in history as well. But the truth is, the Anglos, the Europeans were coming over here, and they were murdering, they were raping, they were stealing land, and you know, and they were committing genocide on Mexicans and natives as well out here in the southwest. Um, so just be aware of that, you know, and we have this whole anti-immigration hate, which stems from the Anglos, and some of you Mexicans and Chicanos get brainwashed into that stuff, and you even oppose Mexicans coming over here to this side of the border. When in fact, this has all been native land originally, and this, obviously Mexicans were down here as well. Mexicans are native as well. So, um, and I see Mexicans have lineage in the Southwest, even before all the Europeans came, before all the Spaniards and Anglos came. So it goes even deeper. So the land back movement goes all the way back to prior to colonization. But I say Reies Tijerina, the whole land grants, it's a start. It's a start for legitimizing land back, right? And you Chicanos, you people into Mexicayo and native activism and all that, you should definitely look into the land grants. And those are ways. And Reyes Tijerina was actually into that. He was actually into the legalities, and he was basically pursuing legal rights of Mexicans and natives over their own land through the land grants and everything. So, for you new generation of Chicanos out here or people into Mexicayo, definitely look into the whole land grants. And if you're into law and policy making and all that, you have certain positions of power in society, definitely pursue that land grant legalities there. You never know. So, but little by little, I mean, all the Southwest, we're full of Mexicans here, man. Full of natives, right? Mexicans are native, right? That's what makes us brown, right? Um, and so we're you know the whole Southwest is full of Mexicans here, and the Anglos, the whites know that they're not the original people there. They know that. It's just some of you Chicanos and natives out here, you don't know that in some sense. Maybe some of you do know, but some of you have no clue about your history and your culture, your indigenous roots and all that. So, as me coming from the Mexica movement, Mexicayot, I don't have a problem with Reyes Tijerina, and his whole land back cause. I see it as an extension of the native resistance, and it's a mechanism to gain our land back, right, from the oppressor, right? It's a mechanism. It's a good way to pursue justice, right? Um, but yeah, I mean, you know, so definitely look into that. Read up on Reyes Lopez Tijerina, and for you Christians out here who are Chicano, you're into the Pentecostalism and all that, or just other denominations of Christianity. You guys need to look into Reyes Tijerina too, and for inspiration too. If you're by a church leader or pastor, or you're a congregant, learn about Reyes Lopez Tijerina and teach others about him and learn about liberation theology, Misión Integral, the Chicano theology, the Chicano cause, and all that. And Reyes Lopez Tijerina was definitely preaching that, and intertwine that. Some of you guys in Christianity, Chicanos, you're thinking like white people. You're thinking like white Christians, right? You're very Eurocentric. Sometimes you even adopt this false patriotism, this white nationalism. You fall into this white republicanism, and you become anti-immigrant. You go against your own people, right? And it's because you've been indoctrinated by the white church. And so, and the opposite occurs as well too, where you have white liberals in their interpretation of Christianity as well too. So it's important to learn about Reyes Lopez Tijerina's interpretation, and it has a Chicano perspective on Christianity, a Chicano interpretation of Christianity, you know, and definitely Tijerina loved God. He followed Jesus, um, and they try to make him look like a crazy guy, that he was violent and all that. No, he was just defending his people and defending, yeah, against the injustice that was going on, and and um, and he may have had unorthodox beliefs at times, but that does not dismiss his legitimate concerns for the Chicano community and the oppression, of the Chicano community. So definitely learn from Reyes Lopez Tijerina. Intertwine your Chicanismo. If you're a Christian, go learn. Get yourself a book called Brown Church. There's even books on Reyes Tijerina as well. But one is Rudy V. Busto. That's a really good book. I think it's called King Tiger, and it's there's some interesting information that you discover about him, and his how he was promoting social justice, civil rights, um, exposing the oppression from a Chicano Pentecostal Christian perspective. Anyway, so a lot of people in Mexicayo says, "Oh, you can't be Christian, and you can't be a indigenous or Chicano." Well, that's a lie. That's not true. Look at Reyes Lopez Tijerina, one of the major figures in the Chicano movement. He was Pentecostal, he was Christian, and he was pro Chicano, right? He was pro Chicano, involved in a lot of activism out here, you know. And we should, as Chicanos, take pride in Reyes Lopez Tijerina. He paved the way, you know, and for us Chicanos and future generations, right? And and ultimately, Reyes Tijerina and me, God is number one, right? God is number one, and we follow Jesus Christ and His truth, right? And we expose the kingdom of Satan and the kingdom of darkness, right? And we bring, you know, we counter evil with good, right? Expose the darkness with truth, wisdom, and the light of Christ, the light of God, right? So definitely, Tijerina was also into what's called contextualization. Contextualization in theology is basically, you have people from a particular culture who have their own version of Christianity, their own interpretation, right? They're cultural, right? They remain cultural. They don't believe in becoming like the white culture. They don't believe in becoming like the white European Christians. and the way they do church. Uh, for example, I'm involved in the good medicine way, and it's a lot of native Christians. And so we believe in maintaining our native culture and identity, knowing our history of, colonization and the church as well and its corruption. But we still follow Christ and his authentic message of the gospel. And we see a distinction between the corrupt colonial Western church versus the message of Jesus and the early disciples and the early church. And we follow more of the authentic message of Christ and his actions and wisdom. And I think Reyes Lopez Tijerina saw that issue too. He saw that the Western um, church and Western, you know, the Western European colonialism was also an issue of oppressing the brown people, the Chicanos, and all that. Uh, so Reyes Tijerina contextualized Christianity from a Chicano perspective. So that's very interesting to know, and it's actually a good reason to even learn and implement this in your Chicano churches out there. You know, for you ministers out there or church leaders, go buy your buy a book on Tijerina. Get that book by Rudy V. Busto. It's called King Tiger. Go get yourself that book, Brown Church, as well, um, and learn about the brown perspective, the brown history of the church, and in its opposition towards colonialism, race, white supremacy, systemic white supremacy, and all that. Go learn about it and teach your congregation, teach your church, you know, and that's what needs to be taught in these brown churches. Get involved in the community. Start, start empowering the community. That's how you do it. And I think Reyes Lopez Tijerina saw the church as a vital force to be, that influences, and and we see that the church was involved in the Chicano movement, and supported at times social justice issues, and movements. So I think Reyes Lopez Tijerina was on the right track in and his contextualization of Christianity with Chicanismo, and I think some of you Chicano churches need to learn more about him and apply Chicano contextualization to your churches as well. I know there's a lot of brown churches out here. You guys need to actually start promoting more Chicanismo, a Chicano perspective, and address the issues and the needs of the Chicano community. Expose the systemic racism and inequalities, the stolen land too, promote the land back movement in your brown churches as well. Imagine that. Imagine if we had more brown teachers and preachers and leaders teaching about the land back movement in the brown churches. Wow. That would be amazing, right? Teaching about Tijerina and his history and involvement, teaching the whole Chicano movement and the history there, right? That would be interesting, right? The brown church, brown social justice, liberation theology. Teach that stuff in your church, man. Let's get some activism going on. organizing, right? You know, we need to get that going in the brown churches out here. Stop acting like these white churches, right? You know, a lot of these white churches are all about, oh, I'm an armchair preacher, right? Just collecting money, doing nothing for the community, and you're just, in your you just go and every Sunday give to the preacher, hear a message, go back home and repeat and nothing else, right? Relearn the social gospel. There was even a whole social gospel movement where you get involved in the community, get involved there, right? And address the issues of the Chicano community as well. The poverty, right? The systemic inequalities, economic oppression, right? Discrimination, the lack of education, lack of consciousness. We have Eurocentric education, right? Eurocentric theologies, right? We need to change all that and start offering more of a liberation theology, a Chicano perspective on things, right? Addressing things that the Chicano community is going through, all this dysfunction of colonialism. Colonialism has created a lot of dysfunction in the Chicano community. That's why we have a issue of drunkenness in the Chicano community. Are people hooked on drugs? They're into poverty? They're into gang banging. They're lot of fatherless homes, right? A lot of the Chicano males going to prison, right? We fill up our people, brown folks fill up. They're the majority of the population in the jail systems out here, especially in California. I would also say in the Southwest, and that's due to economic disparities, right? Inequalities, right? Discrimination, systemic racism. This is what's happening out here. We need to address that. We got to address why are these Anglos rich, wealthy, middle class, rich? Very few are poor out here, but most you go to all these good, wealthy neighborhoods or middle class neighborhoods, and there's hardly any Chicanos there. Most Chicanos are in the poorest communities out here. Go to the rich communities, the high upper class communities, they're mostly white. And how did they get there? It's because they stole our land, right? They stole our resources and they set up their system, their caste system, to benefit them. And they learn ways to filter us out, right? To keep us at a lower level through poverty, through their Eurocentric education, many tactics that they use to keep us subservient to them and building their empire, right? So we need to expose that, especially you brown Christians out here. Just like Tijerina did, he exposed the corruption that was going on. He exposed the corruption in the white church. He exposed the corruption in, with the white government. He exposed the corruption there. He was advocating for Chicano rights, social justice, with a fire and brimstone Pentecostal influence. Definitely. Anyways, I guess nobody has any comments or questions on this subject. So I guess I'll let you guys go for today. Go get that book by Rudy V. Busto, King Tiger. Get your hands on Brown Church by Dr. Romero. Learn about the Brown Church, Brown social justice and theology, liberation theology, Misión Integral, and the Chicano movement and its involvement, like the churches and the early Chicano movement, definitely learn about that, and there's a lot of sources on brown liberation theology, um, and just look into all that. There's a lot of it. Anyways, well, I'm gonna let you guys go. Remember, don't be woke, be conscious. All right, have a good day.